And good morning, everybody. My name is Nan Freund, and on behalf of the Association of Educational Therapists, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our webinar and to welcome back Diana Black Kennedy, who will present strategies to get reluctant writers writing and comprehending better too. The Association of Educational Therapists is the national professional association that sets standards and ethics for the professional practice of educational therapy and provides ongoing professional development for its members and the public. AET offers a variety of professional development programs, including webinars, study groups, regional workshops, and a national conference that enable members and the allied professional community to stay up to date about the latest research-based findings in the fields of education, psychology, and neuroscience. Our 2016 national conference will take place in the San Francisco Bay Area in October. It will feature Dr. Daniel Ansari, who heads the Numerical Cognition Laboratory in the Department of Psychology at the University of Western Ontario, and Dr. Guinevere Eden, Director of the Center for the Study of Learning at Georgetown University, where she studies the brain bases of developmental dyslexia. Finally, I want to call your attention to the Q&A button in the upper left of your screen. There will be an opportunity for Diana to answer your questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions, use the Q&A button to submit them at any time during the webinar. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Diana Black Kennedy. Diana is a board-certified educational therapist with a thriving private practice in San Anselmo, California. Her extensive teaching experience spans second grade through high school, rural, urban, and suburban settings, and public and private schools. She loves working with the whole range of neurodiverse students, including those with learning disabilities and those who are gifted and talented, and those who are twice exceptional. Diana holds a certificate in educational therapy, a master's degree in elementary education, and a master's degree in English literature. She presents across the country and internationally. Diana writes a wonderful blog about education at www.mindsparklearning.com. And she did a superb webinar for us about a year ago entitled Adventures in Neurodiversity, which is available in the webinar archives. It's wonderful to have her back again. Please welcome Diana.
Okay. So thank you very much, Nan. That was awesome. I'm kind of blushing. It was great. So we're going to talk about this morning strategies to get reluctant writers writing and comprehending better too. It's nice that they're both sides of one coin. And for some reason, there you go. Okay, so our agenda for today, we're going to be talking about the fact that reading and writing is not hardwired. This is not our agenda. This is my first slide. I apologize. So one of the important things to realize about writing is that reading and writing are not hardwired in the brain. We did not evolve in order to read and write. We evolved much earlier than that. So spoken language probably dates back to the changed larynx of Homo sapien. In fact, apparently when we started being able to choke on food is the same time we started being able to make more specific utterances that could become language. However, written language only happened at 3,200 BC. So you see that only about 10% of our time speaking has also been accompanied by written language. The other thing to know about writing is it demands the integration of the most number of processes of any communication act. It's more complicated than speaking, it's more complicated than reading. It's the most complicated way we can communicate. So what's involved? Well, the first thing you have to do if you're going to write is you need to visualize what you're going to write about. That's the right side of the brain where we have pictures. Then you need to change the pictures into words, which involves sort of crossing the corpus callosum over to the left side of the brain, where we have language. Then, of course, your teacher says, change the picture into more words, which means crossing the corpus callosum back to the right side, getting more detail, and crossing back to the left side to make it into more words. And you need to do it in more detailed words, which means you're basically running back and forth across the corpus callosum until the teacher is happy and says you don't need any more words. But that's not all. That's only the beginning. After that, you need to encode the words, put them into the code, literally, which involves moving from oral language to written language, which means that you need to keep those words in your auditory loop, which is part of working memory, and then it's going to call on your phonemic awareness, and then translate that into phonics, and then and what you need with phonics is the symbol imagery. Some people call it orthographic memory of what the words look like, how they're spelled. Then you need to make your hand actually write those words. And that means you have to have visual motor integration. Some people call this graphomotor integration, while keeping all the rest of your words, encoded words, in mind, which of course involves working memory. Then you have to compare the written words that you've gotten on the paper to the symbol imagery or orthographic memory, and or your phonics knowledge if you're not exactly sure how to visualize it, which involves calling on your visual working memory and your auditory working memory. You need to correct those written words, which involves, again, visual motor integration and working memory. And then you need to repeat again and again and again, because we've just described the dog. We haven't gone on to plot, character, any of that stuff. So it's no wonder that there are kids who are really reluctant to write. So who are these reluctant writers? Well, I'm going to talk about 4 different kinds of reluctant writers. Kids with dyslexia, kids with visual motor difficulties, kids with expressive language difficulties, and kids on the spectrum. So let's start with dyslexia. So dyslexia is most commonly associated with weak phonemic awareness. This is the piece that says, I've gotten the words in written language in my head, but how do I spell them? How am I going to put them down? And the biggest difficulty is encoding those words in spelling. Okay. Usually with these dyslexic kids, unless they have something else going on, their oral language is very strong. They tell the great story. This is the kid who comes in, you say, what are you going to write about? They talk and talk, it's beautiful, it's amazing. And then they write the shortest version possible. So they say, I got a new dog, he's cute, after telling you for 15 minutes all about the new dog. They use the simplest words possible. I had a student who was about to write down, it was a fabulous experience. And he thought about it, how do you spell fabulous? And he wrote, it was fun. So how do you remediate these kids who are reluctant to write because of dyslexia? Well, as most of us know, you need explicit, systematic, multisensory phonics instruction. This isn't just good for reading, this is what they need for spelling and writing as well. It should be Orton-Gillingham based. That's the gold standard for working with kids with dyslexia. And remember that there's a connection between reading, writing, and spelling. They're all connected. In fact, studies show that work on spelling explicitly helps kids read more than reading a lot helps kids with spelling. So that's an interesting fact. And this should be at the kids' independent level. So you don't want to really push them to try to be, you don't want to teach them at the level they should be at. you know, this is when the parents sometimes come to me and say, he should be reading Great Expectations, shouldn't he? Because I want him to learn how to read and write difficult material. Well, that's going to be wasted because it's not in their zone of proximal development, as teachers like to say, which basically means it's not in the area around what they already know where you can add a couple steps forward. So a lot of what these kids need with writing is to use the writing process rather than just, bleh, I've got a final draft. They're going to need to separate out brainstorming and organizing. That's when they can talk and talk and talk and talk. Their rough draft, and really have to focus them and yourself on the fact they should not worry about spelling. The only purpose of a rough draft is to get all those ideas down. If they're stopping and worrying about spelling, they're going to stop the flow of ideas. Revisions, you still don't want to worry about spelling. A lot of kids, when you say revise this, they put 3 periods in, they capitalize something, and then they try to check their spelling. This is not the time for that. This is the time to really think about those big structural, stylistic word changing. Do you need to put the most exciting piece first? Do you need to answer more questions? And then the final draft happens, and this is when kids need to correct their spelling. But be aware, the worse their spelling is, the more important it is to not make them responsible for every single word, because that's just going to depress them and overwhelm them. So what I like doing is focusing on a few words, covering patterns that I know the kids already know, and then I'll correct the rest for them, and they can write it down. Or if we're working on a computer, I'll let them tell me to write it down, and that's fine. So the other thing to work on with someone with dyslexia is not just remediation, which we were talking about, but also accommodations. So it's important to know, because a lot of teachers, parents, even kids think, well, if I get accommodation, A, my learning's going to stop, and B, it's kind of cheating. But what's important to know is that remediation and accommodation need to be simultaneous parallel paths. So it's not either or. It's not, now we're accommodating this kid, so we're going to stop teaching them anything. But you need to have both happening at once. The reason for this is you can't afford to wait until they can write fluently at grade level to start working on sentence structure, developing their voice, and improving storytelling and essay writing. And basically to access those higher order thinking skills. Remember, these are kids with really strong oral language, so they can be working on this before they can spell every word consistently. Now, to be at the student's independent performance level. If that means that they are working on Mac and Tab at the time that everybody else is reading The Giver, so be it. You need to hit their independence performance level in order for them to make progress. At this point, what you're doing is filling in the gaps of their basic skills. The accommodation, on the other hand, needs to be at the kid's cognitive level or oral language level. Sometimes this is grade level, sometimes it is not. Sometimes it's above, sometimes it's below. This is going to be to give them access to grade level, cognitive level, appropriate content, and to access those higher order thinking skills. So to reiterate, accommodation is not cheating. It's about fair and equal access to the material. And really, you can think of this as a ramp into the content. Just like a ramp on the outside of a library or a hospital is not cheating somehow for somebody who needs it. These accommodations are not cheating as a way into the material. And it's really necessary for the kid to keep developing both pieces, what they're good at and what they're weak at. So how do you do this? Well, one thing that's really important is to analyze the task that you're assigning to a child or that's being assigned to a child, and figure out what your discrete goals are. Are your goals spelling at this point? Are your goals grammar at this point? Or are your goals getting a good 5-paragraph essay with introductory sentences for each paragraph? You need to think about the validity of the tests and tasks. Now, validity means, are you testing or asking for what you think you're asking for? And a lot of times, if you're doing a math test with word problems, and the kid has to write out answers, let's say they're doing Common Core where you need to explain your work in words, is that really about spelling and grammar, or is that about the mathematical thinking? So effective accommodations for kids with dyslexia, they're going to be focused at this level of getting the words into correctly spelled or written language. So they need to be taught explicitly. A lot of times schools will say, sure, he can use an iPad or she can use a computer, and then the kid has no idea how to use them explicitly, how to use them effectively. And then the school says, it doesn't help. So they need to be taught explicitly how to use these and how to make it effective for their process. Some of these accommodations are going to be disposable crutches. They're going to use them until they don't need to use them anymore, and then goodbye. Some of them are going to be lifetime supports. I think about Ben Foss. Some of you might have read his book, The Dyslexia Empowerment Plan, or gone to his website, Headstrong Nation, where he continued to need to use dictation to write and audio books in order to listen, as he finished Berkeley and then went on to Stanford to get a double degree in law and an MBA. Not an unsuccessful person, continued to use these supports for the rest of his life, or is continuing because he's not dead. And this needs to be integrated throughout classes, not just writing class. If they've got writing in science, it needs to be done in there. If they've got writing in math, it needs to be done in there. In history, it's not just the writing classes. And it should be integrated at home. So they're using the same process at home that they were using at school, so that it really streamlines that process. Now, we know that at this point, there's so many ways to do this. It used to be that we would say, drag in dictation, and everybody was excited that you could dictate and have your words show up. But at this point, there's so much more, including your iPhone, which you can dictate into. I like using notes. It's a really good dictation on your iPhone. You don't have to work very hard. A thing I really like about it is it keeps listening to you even when you pause. Some of the dictation things stop, but this one keeps listening to you, and then you can send it to Word, you can send it to Google Docs. There's, if you Google dictation apps out there, then you get all sorts of things. Here's 10 of the best dictation apps. Of course, your computer itself has dictation possibilities. These are the kids who need extended time on writing assignments because the writing itself is very slow and laborious for them. They should get modified homework load, time-based versus length-based, because if you say everybody write 1 page, if it takes them 2 hours and it takes everybody else half an hour, that becomes unfair. And they should have no penalty for spelling or punctuation errors except on something that they had a final draft on. That means essay tests, they shouldn't be penalized for spelling because they didn't have any time to review it. They just were writing and writing and writing. And so it's unfair. This is going back to the validity. What are you testing on an essay test? Is it really the spelling, or is it the way they're thinking and processing the material? And this is what I tell all my students when I was in a classroom, and this is a very useful sort of metaphor, even with the students themselves, if they're resisting their own accommodation because they think it's cheating, is fair does not mean same. If you have glasses, if someone in your class has glasses, it's not cheating or unfair that they have glasses and nobody else does, right? And I ask this to the students, would that be cheating that you say to this kid, you can't wear glasses unless you bring 23 pairs of glasses for everybody else? The same is true for hearing, crutches. what I always like to emphasize when I was a classroom teacher and to the kids when I'm working one-on-one is that what's fair is for everybody to get their individual needs met, not for everybody to get the exact same thing. Okay, so let's move on to kids who are reluctant writing because they have visual motor difficulties or graphomotor difficulties. What does this mean? Well, it means that the brain tells the hand to write words and it kind of gets blocked. So there's the physical act of writing is difficult. A lot of times these are the kids with really big writing, with loop-the-loop writing. Can't remember if I say that. Writing words, letters backwards. The problem is in the hand and in their visual perception or in their coordination of the two. You can tell these kids a lot of times with the wraparound pencil grip because the most efficient way to write is to use your intrinsic fine motor skills here. But if those are weak, where it's hard to do this, then you're going to wrap your thumb around it, which basically moves the entire thing into a gross motor exercise. This is also the kids who start the letters from the bottom, loop the letters backwards, or do the loop-the-loop letters. They start maybe the A in the wrong direction, and they just kind of keep doing a circle 2 or 3 times to make it look right. Those are good keys, good red flags that something's going on with their visual motor difficulties. These are the kids that I tend to refer to in OT. Occupational therapists, the ones at school especially, do the handwriting really well. They really know how to do that. Some of them, I should say. If they're just going to hang out in the classroom and say, no, you made that letter wrong, that's not so helpful. What they need to do is understand how to make the hand stronger and then how to work the fine motor skills. Handwriting Without Tears is a program created by an OT because her son came home in 1st grade with absolutely unrecognizable handwriting. And when she decided to work with her son for 3 weeks, I think it was, he came out with beautiful handwriting. So she really wanted to make teachers able to do this kind of program. Dictation is good for these kids because it's the act of writing that's really difficult. Of course, again, you need to teach them how to do this effectively. Typing is sometimes good for these kids. You have to check because sometimes the typing itself is difficult for them, but for some kids, it's a huge relief. Okay, so what else do we have? Expressive language difficulties. These are kids who have trouble with the whole oral language piece. So this is word finding difficulty, just getting from the image of the dog to the words. It's an oral language issue. These are kids who are going to have trouble while they're speaking as well. Usually their receptive language and vocabulary is higher than their expressive vocabulary. They have low rapid naming, indicates either slow processing speed or slow retrieval. Either way, it's probably going to affect their expressive language. And this is sort of the tip of the tongue phenomenon. You know, oh, what's that word? What's that word? I can think about it. And sometimes they pull the wrong word. And here's a cartoon about that. How much for the tip, just for the tip of the tongue? Wait, I know the answer. It's, oh, I almost had it. It's so close. So he's having retrieval difficulties with his language. These are kids that I tend to refer to as speech language pathologists. They have the expertise to work on this receptive or expressive language difficulty more than your average educational therapist, unless you're really trained in working in this specific area. These kids also need to overlearn the material. The more they know it, the more automatic it is, the faster it's retrieved. They need to do it through multiple pathways because research has shown that you can't necessarily speed up processing speed, but if you have a word, the more connections to it, the more neural pathways you have to it, the faster you recall it and the faster you'll be able to write it as well as read it. These are kids where they also need to develop the metacognitive strategies like, oh, I'm losing a word, so either I'm going to ask for a second or I'm going to use filler, or I'm going to use circumlocution and find another word that I can think of. Maybe all I need to do is take a deep breath. Maybe I need to take a sip of water. It's these types of strategies that can help them. The other thing to do is they need to have their oral language developed. And we're going to go into that in a lot of detail in the next section, so I'm not going to go into it much here. But the stronger their oral language, then the stronger their written language. And that's the section we're going to go on to. The program that's created just for this, and it's generally for younger kids, but it's RAVO. Marianne Wolf created this for the kids who have trouble with fluency in reading. And the fluency in reading is going to affect the fluency in writing. And RAVO is one that really works on making those multiple neuro pathways to every word. So she talks about creating a really rich semantic map for each word. Some games that are good to play to sort of supplement the speech and language therapy that they're going to get. Guess Who is a wonderful game. You pick a person, they pick a person, and then you ask questions to use a process of elimination to get to the person. And it's great to develop the metacognitive strategies. So when I'm playing this with a kid, I say, oh, wow, you asked for eye color. That's really going to that's going to knock out all the people with blue eyes. Or, okay, you asked for, is it this kid? But if you keep asking those questions, I'm probably going to win because that's a very specific answer. Can you ask a more general question? Spot It is a great one. If you guys haven't played it, you have to picture, let me back up. Every card on it has about 10 pictures, and every card has one and only one match for every other card. So you put the two cards down and you have to visually scan and then say out loud the match, and then you get the cards. And I had a student with this expressive language disability who just wanted to point. And so we worked on, well, instead of pointing, say the word. And works on speed, but in a really fun, non-threatening way. Headbands is another great one to develop oral language. You put a card on your head, which makes it fun automatically, and you don't know what it is, and you have to ask questions to your teammates to figure out what it is. And this is another great way to work on categorizing, to work on going from the general to the specific and organizing your thinking. Because if you ask, is it a hummingbird? Is it a hot dog? It's going to be forever. But if you ask, sort of in the good old fashioned 20 questions, animal, vegetable, mineral, is it a food? Is it a breakfast food? Is it hot? Is it something you cook? Is it meat? It helps you narrow down. So it's good to develop those skills for a kid. Okay, now we're going to get to kids on the ASD spectrum, autism disorder spectrum disorder, sorry about that, my own expressive language difficulties. And remember that this is a spectrum, so it can go all the way from Rain Man and somebody who's really totally nonverbal to somebody who's just kind of quirky and just has trouble coming up with their own ideas writing. A lot of times I've had students where the parent comes to me, they're undiagnosed, and they say, I don't know what's wrong with my child because they spell really well, they learn to read really well, their grammar is fine, but when they're given a writing assignment in class, they melt down. They just freak out. So with these kids on the Sunday, big is actually at the very beginning connecting those pictures and images to the words and vice versa. Of course, vice versa is the problem with reading comprehension, but pictures to words is trouble with writing and with oral language. So if you think about it, the pictures we've already talked about are on the right side of the brain, the language is on the left side of the brain, and what you're really trying to do is build a bridge between those images and those words. So the program that's really created specifically to do this is Visualize and Verbalize, by Linda Mood Bell. And first I have to say, I'm not Linda Mood Bell. I'm not trained to be Linda Mood Bell. Linda Mood Bell doesn't know I'm giving this presentation. They certainly haven't said that I work for them or any of those things. So go take a class with Linda Mood Bell, but this is going to be a little bit about how it works. So their program is highly structured, systematic. It builds the neural bridge and networks between the left and the right hemispheres, between those pictures and those words. And there you go, it builds the connections between the words and the pictures. So one of the things, the key pieces of Visualize and Verbalize is that it uses structure words to guide visualization. If you notice, these are right behind me. And this is where I sit with students, and they sit looking at me, so they see this all the time. You create a picture together. So you might be using the words and they're using words also. A good way to start is to say, okay, I picture a cat. And then they say, okay, the cat is black. And then you say, okay, it's black with a big fluffy tail. And then you keep going as long as you can. And then at the end, you have them describe the entire gestalt of this cat that you've created together. So it starts with describing a picture based on first a picture. So you show them a picture and then they just describe it with as much detail as possible. And while they're doing this and throughout the process, you can flesh out what they describe by asking them questions, sort of forced answer questions. So you say, well, is it big or is it small? Use your gestures because that helps connect meaning. Is it tall? Is it short? Do you have blonde hair or brown hair? Did he wear jeans or did he wear slacks? And that also develops the vocabulary, but asking those questions is one of the ways to develop those neural pathways. It also models what a reader needs to know in their writing in order to get a good picture in their head. They move on to having a word that they describe as much as possible. And then sentences, short sentences that are very simple, that they describe the picture in their head, and they go on to paragraphs and entire stories. Let me back up for a second. This is really great, again, to get that gestalt. Sometimes you show a picture. There's a picture in Visualize and Verbalize of a park with a park bench and a man, and he's feeding a squirrel. Sometimes you ask a kid, well, describe this picture so I can see it in my head. And they'll say, there's a squirrel. And so it's also a time to say, is there a human in it? We want to describe the human first. You can describe from the top down. You don't want to start with his socks, with his face. Make sure you describe the face. So a lot of metacognitive coaching in this also. Now, if you're doing pure Visualize and Verbalize, the way that it's sort of meant to be, you do it for the entire session, kind of again and again. I'm sure that that really helps, but for me personally, it kind of gets a little boring. So I move on after about 20 minutes, which is about enough time to do 1 or 2 paragraphs. And the golden rule with this moving on piece, which is what I call beyond Visualize and Verbalize, is everything you do, call it a game. If you call it a game, the kids are like, great, it's a game, it's going to be fun. It gets them ready for that. The other golden rule is pander, pander, pander. Because especially if these kids are sort of on the autism spectrum, they've got special interests, and you might as well leverage that special interest for all that it's worth. You see here chickens and Minecraft and Angry Birds. Each one of these is the special interest of some of the children that I've worked with. And I'll tell you a story about the girl who liked chickens. I saw her when she was about 11 or 12, and she was being homeschooled. They were doing a great job of it, and she loved chickens. She raised chickens, she trained chickens. I didn't even know you could do that. She showed chickens. She was part of 4-H. And every time we were going to do a writing thing, I would say, well, what should we write about today? And she'd think, maybe chickens. We wrote about chickens the entire time. She would describe chickens. She would compare chickens. She would do an informational writing about chickens. She would do stories about chickens and chickens escaping and episodic narrative stories about herself. Well, it just so happens, coincidentally, that I just started working with her younger sister. And I said something about this student always writing about chickens because the younger sister said something about birds. And her older sister's interest in them. I said, yeah, she just loved chickens. And the younger sister said, you know, she expanded to wild birds and she just got into Cornell, the School of Ornithology. So she's now in college to study birds. So never underestimate the power of a special interest. It can really lead somewhere. So here are a whole bunch of games that I like to play to develop oral language. This is the stuff that works for the kids with a language disorder as well as these kids. So one of them I call Guess Which One. I've named it. I don't know if it exists other than the way I play it and if it has a real name. But what I do is I get 20 to 30 small pictures. You can use interesting playing cards, specialized playing cards. I tend to use the back of the calendar of calendars. You know, there's a preview on the back and I cut these out. If you donate to National Wildlife Conservancy like once, you'll get these calendars every year, and then I use those. And then I use note cards for the kids. And what I do is I spread the pictures out on the table face up, and I say, okay, each one of us is going to pick one of these secretly. And don't tell me which one it is. And then we're going to describe it with as much detail as possible. If the kid is ready to write, we do it in writing on the note card. If they're not ready to write, then we just do it orally. And then at the end, each person describes or reads the description to the other player. The other player is going to guess which one they're talking about. So I pander again with this. I'm going to have a whole someone interested in chickens. If they are interested in Lego, maybe I'll go download a whole bunch of pictures of Lego. So as the student reads their description to me, I think aloud the sorting. So if with animals they say, oh, it's snowing, then I'll find all the pictures of the animals in the snow. I say, okay, these are the ones in the snow. And then they say it has feathers. And I go, oh, then it can't be these guys because they don't have feathers. The other thing is if the kid is unclear, even though I kind of know what they're getting at, if they're being unclear or it could be two different ones, I make sure to be confused and go, gosh, I can't figure out if it's these two. Is there some detail you can give me that would tell me which one it is? Then as you read your own description, I always make sure to model excellent writing. So I'm going to put as many details in as possible. The nice thing about this, oh, and then I asked the student what gave it away. So what made you know what I was talking about? And that's building that metacognitive information. The nice thing about this is you can do all sorts of different alternatives. So emotion cards, kids who are having trouble figuring out emotions and facial expressions, you can get these various emotion cards, super duper published. One that has the one on top, the others I think I got from Barnes & Noble. And so this helps build socio-emotional skills. At the end, I usually try to add in a brief discussion of plot, whether this is formally or informally. I'll say something like, gosh, yeah, that one really looks angry. I wonder what had happened right before. And if you want to develop that, they can then write a story about what happened to make this person that angry and what happened maybe next. It's good to do this with figurines. Sometimes I use little animal figurines. I got skull figurines, you know, all of these sort of tubaloo animals or any other figurines you have. It's good because you can target vocabulary concepts. If you've got specific vocabulary the student needs to use, then you're going to use objects or pictures that focus on those vocabulary concepts. Now, another thing that I love doing, and this is also very, very flexible, you can use it in a lot of different ways, I call folder games. And what you need for this is scene builders. I've given you a picture of this. My favorite is Mud Puppy. You can go look at Mud Puppy. They have boxes of magnetic scenes. And so it's a background, and then it's also things like with the monsters, it's different heads, different bodies, different arms, different legs, different background materials. They're really nice. They have gendered ones, you know, if you want to think that way. They've got the mermaids and they've got the ballerinas. They also have robots. It's sort of a shame. Don't want it to be there, but you need to make sure to pander to the kids' interest. You also need an empty file folder. This is going to go between you and the other student. So the first person behind the folder is going to start building a scene. I give the kid the choice whether I'm going to build it first and they're going to follow me, or whether they're going to build it first. So they start building a scene. As they're building it, they describe in detail what's going on. So they'll say, I'm taking the monster's head that's green and has gills, and I'm putting it right in the middle, sort of at the top near the cloud. The second person tries to duplicate the scene exactly just based on their words. You can't see it because there's a folder in between. Ask clarifying questions. Which cloud is it next to? Is it next to the big poofy one, or is it next to the small thin one? And then at the very end, when everything is finished, you have the big reveal. Make sure to make this very exciting. So you go, ta-da! And then you compare your scene with their scene. And you sort of debrief, like, wow, you really described this well. I got the exact same things. They're in the right position. However, the moon, you said, is up in the sky. I put it to the left and you put it to the right. So I guess I needed some cue on that. So other folder games, again, it's as many types of things as you can imagine. It's very flexible. Drawing, I've had kids draw what they want and tell me what they're drawing at the same time. This is great for kids who love to draw. Not so good for the kids who are like, no, don't make them do that. Pattern blocks, especially if you're also doing geometry and you want to develop that math language, but they can do a lot of good abstract designs in this way. Legos are great. A lot of these kids love Legos. They love building it. They can build something in 3 dimensions and try to describe it to you. And again, remember to pander. If they're Lego fans, use the Legos. If they're whatever, the chicken fans, maybe they're going to draw a chicken. But let them do something that's really interesting to them. So another thing that I like doing is I call play and record. Again, I don't know if other people call it something else, but I have puppets in my classroom or in my office, and I also have figurines. You can use either one. But in this case, the student gets to play and make up a little play either with the puppets or with the animals. And then if they need it to help their memory, I'll take notes, or maybe they can take notes as they go, depending on what their level of competence is. And then at the end, they're going to write the story that they just acted out. So this is a good way to get the juices flowing if they're like, I don't know what to play with, but then you give them a whole bunch of dinosaurs because they like dinosaurs and they're like, oh, T-Rex. You can write that out. I've had this done in the classroom where 2 kids didn't know what to do, so they both played this together and then they co-wrote the story that they made. And again, as with everything, pander. If they like dinosaurs, use dinosaurs. If they like animals, use the animals they like. If they like little Star Wars figures, use the Star Wars figures they like. Another thing that I like doing, I call forced choice storytelling. So these are the kids who they really don't like open-ended stories. Now, some kids, like the kids with dyslexia or ADHD who have a gazillion stories in their head, you say, write whatever you want. They're like, yes, this is awesome. And then there are the kids who you say that. No, for these kids, the more open-ended it is, the better. And they'll come up with stories you've never, ever thought to assign. I've had kids write about, desert islands. I've kids write about basketball, all sorts of things, just because they have the choice. But other kids, you say, hey, this is open-ended, and they just freak out. It's too open-ended for them. Their brain doesn't work in that way. They want structure, and they want to know what they're supposed to write. So they need the prompts for visualizing. Remember, these are the kids who have trouble connecting the words to the visuals. And sometimes if you don't give them a prompt, there's nothing there. So what can I write about? So what I like doing with these kids is I ask a series of either or questions, and I make sure to cover the story elements. And then as soon as I see their light bulb go off where they've got the story in their head, I stop. Otherwise, I keep going until I see that light bulb. So a lot of times what I do is I say, okay, well, what do you want to write? Do you want to write something true or made up? That's usually my first question. And then I say human or animal characters, boy or girl. Usually they pick what they are, but still asking them is going to help. Realistic or fantasy? Is it going to be funny, sad, or scary? Where is it located? I know that's not forced choice, but sometimes they can focus on that at this point. Otherwise, I say, do you want it at school or at home or in a forest? You know, I'll just keep brainstorming with them. And then if they're still not excited or have a story in their head, I ask them, what is the problem? Of course, this is problem solution, story structure. And then, of course, what is the solution? Usually they don't need that at this point. The light bulb has already gone off in their head. As I'm asking them questions, if they need it, especially if they have memory issues, then I'm going to take notes for them, maybe on a graphic organizer, so that I have a graphic organizer that says character, setting, plot, problem, solution. I'm going to take notes onto that. Some kids don't need that. And again, remember to pander. If you know that they like soccer, then you can say, do you want to write a story about soccer? Do you know, use their interests. And I suggest it. And I'll say, oh, you could even write about somebody learning to play guitar, or you can write about your last soccer game, if you know that that's what they're interested in. Sorry, let me back up for a second, because what you're doing is you're structuring and ordering, you're bringing organization to this. I want to point out, I was just doing some research on kids with executive function issues, and sometimes it's not that they are on the autism spectrum. Sometimes these are the kids with executive function issues, and the whole organizing and noticing structure and noticing the story grammar is really not there. So this is a great way to scaffold that for kids who really are just disorganized, and that's why it's hard for them to access their storytelling capabilities. Okay, so for everybody who's in a classroom, everybody one-on-one, one of the things that's really useful is an authentic need to write, that if you just have to write because the teacher told you to, it's not very exciting. So some things that I like to capitalize on in these teachable moments is email, texting, or Facebook, especially if they have a friend who's gone, or I've had people whose mom or dad is on vacation, and I said, do you want to write them an email? Do you want to text to them? Birthday card, they tell you when they come in that they have a best friend whose birthday it is, or they're going to a birthday party. Say, hey, do you want to write them a birthday card? It's nice to have a whole bunch that they can pick from, or they can decorate their own. Friends, parents, and siblings. I've gotten some great long emails, sometimes dictated to me, sometimes they write it themselves. And if they come in excited about a current event or talking about it, it's a good time to write about this. This, you need to be careful that it's really something they're interested in and not something you think they should be interested in. I always offer it as a choice. Sometimes someone will come in and they're upset about something. I say, what do you want to write about that? And they go, no. Okay, I'm not going to force the issue, because if they don't want to write about it, then it's not going to be a really useful activity. It's also nice to have cool stationery, fancy pens. Let me show you this for a second. I got these amazing pencils. I don't know if you can see it. They're colored pencils, but they have 4 different colors on them. So as you're writing, it turns into sort of rainbow writing. This is great to get kids writing. They can even do their spelling words, but they're using this, so all of a sudden they're really excited. So sometimes that's the thing that'll hook the kid. You say, oh, I have this black paper and these gel pens. Do you want to write something? They're like, yeah. Okay, it's got to be a story. What do you want to write about? So let me sort of finish with saying, what is the big picture here? What is it that we as teachers need to think about, or educational therapists need to think about? We're really empowering kids to tell their own story. We're letting them eventually grow to the place where they can say what's inside them. They can say whether it's fictional and they're working through a process, whether it's about themselves, but it's telling those stories that are important for them. And if we can empower them to do that, then we can really change their life in a pretty profound way. Thank you very much.
So Diana, thank you so much. You've just given us a whole lot of wonderful ideas for ways to help our kids who are allergic to writing, which is how I often think about it. I think some of our kids almost break out in hives when you ask them to write something. So we have some questions, and actually let me just start with a little nuts and bolts, because we've had several people ask about handouts. There should have been a link to the handouts in your registration confirmation email. And in any case, the handout will be available on the AET website when we post the video recording of this webinar. So you will have an opportunity to get the handout then also. And now for some questions about the presentation. Victoria asks, do you feel it's okay for a child to dictate to you and for you to write down what they said orally?
Absolutely. I do that a lot. I actually am very proud of my setup in my office because it feels high tech to me. I have a projector, which is up there, and it's got an Apple TV, so we can write, I can dictate on my computer, and it shows up on a screen, so they can watch as I'm writing. One thing you need to be careful of is we sophisticated language users sometimes almost unconsciously correct their language. And I think it's much more powerful if they see their own language. And I'll tell you a quick little story. I can't remember the word, but I was working with a kid, dyslexia, auditory processing, and some language processing issues. And he mispronounced a word, and I wrote it correctly for him. And he said, no, I said this other word. Sorry, I can't remember it. And I said, well, actually, that's not the word. It's this. You know, and he was like, no kidding. So here, just because he could see what I was writing as he was dictating to me, he got to get a lot of feedback that he wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And again, this is something that's probably a disposable crutch. It's one of those accommodations that, yeah, you hope eventually they don't need you anymore, but I think it's a really appropriate way to get these kids writing.
Yes, and I know I use dictation a lot with my students who really struggle with writing to help them at least develop the language formulation that they need, so that when they are more either physically or cognitively able to write, the language formulation is there. Another question for you, Diana, from Victoria. She's asking, do you feel it's okay for, oh, I'm sorry, whoops, I just did that one. The question shifted on my screen. Teresa asked, how do you help a student with visual perceptual issues whose fine motor skills are fine?
Okay, yeah, you know, the test that I really like for this whole area is the Beery visual test of visual motor integration, because it starts with, is their visual motor integration good? And then it lets you see if it's more the visual process or more the motor process, so you can really tease it out. So if you found that the kid's motor process is fine, but their visual, it's a visual issue, You can do a couple of things. Large print is helpful if you're going to write things for, I know that this is about reading for a second. If you're going to write things, if you're going to take dictation, use a sans serif font, one without the little jiggly things. It turns out Times New Roman is one of the hardest prints to read for kids like this. Write big. And then one of the things that's useful for them is the sort of more Slingerland approach to handwriting, where they start very big on a board and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. You can also find, well, that's more motor. I was going to say paper that has a raised line, so it gives them a cue right then, although that's more motor. Some of the crossing the midline issues, and I will say this, even though it's controversial, so you would have to sort of have your own opinion and do your own research about it, but these might be the kids that you want to, if you believe in it, send for a developmental optometrist, ophthalmologist, can never remember which one, an assessment to work on visual things directly, visual processing directly.
Jocelyn asks whether you have any thoughts about best strategies for high school and college students who are reluctant writers.
Yeah, at this point, they're probably not doing a lot of fiction writing, right? Their big thing is essay writing. And what I found is that they need structure and they need that outline. So I work a lot with explicitly teaching the outline, meaning the outline, meaning a 5-paragraph essay where the introductory paragraph lays out the map of the paragraphs they're going to have. And a lot of times, again, the more they struggle, the more explicit they need a structure to hold on to. And then later, when they get better, they can play loosey-goosey with it. I had one student who had these language issues, and as soon as she learned the formulation in every paragraph, first then next, or first then last, she used it every single paragraph. Now, eventually we want to say, find some other ways to do that. But for her, that was a structure that organized her thinking as well as organized her writing, and she held on to it like a lifeboat or a life raft, you know what I'm talking about. So a lot of structure helps these kids. Sometimes you need to go back and see if there's some missing piece. They may, even in high school or college, need help with decoding and encoding, sort of that multisensory, systematic, explicit phonics can sometimes free things up. And I would also work with dictation with these kids.
Okay, thank you, Diana. Yeah, and another thing that I know I've found very helpful with older kids who are working on essays is the outline function in Microsoft Word, because you can reorganize your ideas very easily. You can collapse levels down to all level 1 or level 2 and move things around, and anything that's underneath that level will follow with it. It's if you haven't tried it, it's worth experimenting with.
And Google Docs has the same thing.
Can you do that with Google Docs too? That's great. Okay, Maria Carmen is asking, can you please give some graphic organizers for high schoolers with difficulties?
Yes. I'm going to refer you to a place that has some great graphic organizers. Architects for Learning is a website by Anthony Bashir and Bonnie Singer, who work a lot with kids with executive functioning issues, and they have some really great, very educational graphic organizers. That is, they're very explicit about what they need at each place, and my internet connection is unstable. I don't know what that means. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. It's kind of stalling every now and then, but
okay. Because some graphic organizers out there are very implicit in what they're asking for. You need to be as explicit as possible. Another great source of good explicit graphic organizers is the Jane Schaffer website and the Jane Schaffer method. And then I can work with Nan to put up some good graphic organizers as a handout.
Terrific, thank you. Jamie is wondering at what age should kids start keyboarding instead of writing? And this may have to be our last question unless we want to go a little bit over time, in which case I have some announcements I'd like to make first. But at what age should kids start keyboarding instead of writing?
You know, there's mixed ideas about this. There was a big study just came out that said even for college age students, if they're writing with handwriting, it helps them remember lectures more. It was sort of an interesting study. But I would say as young as they need to go, there's a great phonics program based on going from encoding first and then learning decoding called Talking Fingers, which has little kids working on the keyboard. The one thing that I've heard is that the younger kids need smaller keyboards, which is fine because a lot of the new laptop keyboards or iPad keyboards are smaller for them, but you don't want them to have to go really wide. I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay, we have a number of questions. Can you stay on a little bit longer, Diana? Okay, so before we go to those other questions, though, I just want to open my screen. And share a few announcements with you. First of all, you'll receive an email tomorrow documenting 1 hour of AET continuing education credit. And as I've already mentioned, this webinar was recorded, and the recording will be available on the AET website in about a week. And my slide doesn't want to advance. There we go. And I also wanted to mention that you can support the profession of educational therapy. It's a profession that makes a real difference in people's lives. AET welcomes your membership. There are various levels of membership available, which you can find on the AET website, www.aetonline.org. So we invite you to join us. And now, oops, what happened? Are we still there? Okay, there we go. So now I'll continue with the questions so anybody who has to leave us at this point at least knows the critical information about the webinar itself. Okay, let me page down here a little bit. We've got a bunch of questions here. Victoria is also wondering, what about suggesting other words? You know, if a student wants to put down fun or nice because it's easy and you say, let's look up other words for fun, nice, very. And actually that ties in with another question about using a thesaurus and whether you ever encourage kids or teach kids how to use a thesaurus, particularly kids who have retrieval problems.
Yeah, I would not do it in the first draft, even if you're taking dictation, because you want to focus on the ideas, but it's part of the revision process, sort of word choice. And yeah, I think offering other words yourself or having them look them up. Of course, you've got thesaurus on the computer at this point. So if they're on the computer or you're on the computer, you can look it up right there, or you can use a real traditional thesaurus. But I've found that's a great way to sort of encourage the vocabulary. You need to talk about making sure that the meaning is the one you want, because sometimes kids can look up a word and there's an alternate meaning for it, and then they use the word for that. So that's one thing to be careful of. And also it's a good opportunity to talk about shades of meaning. If they say fun, do you really mean fabulous, fantastic, or do you mean it was pleasant? Or if they say angry, do you really mean furious, or do you mean put out? So make sure that you teach those things explicitly. But yeah, and I would do it at the revision place, not the actual dictation part.
Okay. Mumita, and I hope I'm saying your name right, asked whether you have any suggestions for kids with Ireland syndrome.
Mm. So this is interesting. It's another place where the research is pretty iffy. You know, the Irlen syndrome or the scotopic sensitivity, all of these things. The research that says it's useful tends to be from the Irlen people themselves. The research that says it's not very useful is sort of from other people. It's been hard for other people to find that it's useful. On the other hand, sort of anecdotally, I found some kids like having a screen, or you know what I mean, an overlay. So I have some laying around, and sometimes I suggest it, especially if they talk about the fact that the black and white is really bothering them. You can also, on an iPad or even on a computer, you can switch the screen to black background on white. That helps some kids. And there's an app you can get called Beeline Reader. It's of course for reading, but it's an interesting one that puts the words you're trying to read in color and helps you move through the line and then moves down to the next one. For writing, if you're writing on a computer, you can change the background, flip it, or do something else. And if you aren't on the computer, you can just use colored paper, and it's going to decrease the difference between the black and the white if you're using a blue piece of paper or a green piece of paper, you know, light pastel.
Okay. Carol is asking a question about cultural differences, which is an interesting one. She says, I have a number of Asian students where English is a second language with the parents, but the child is American born and has only heard Chinese in the home. The parents are not comfortable with their flow of English language. Any thoughts on ways to combine the culture into the development of the child's writing?
Yeah. So first of all, the English is a second language. All the research on bilingualism says that the people who want to speak Chinese because they're fluent in it, it is actually the right choice. It's better for a kid to hear fluent language, even if it's not English, than to hear non-fluent English. You would rather not a kid pick up the awkward grammar and the awkward wording of a second language learner. And also the differences in where they are in their own language. If they're being raised bilingual, they do catch up. And in fact, there's some research that shows that eventually it's quite a cognitive benefit to be raised bilingual. So the way I like to approach it, if the kid is bilingual like that or is having trouble, is to be super respectful of the other language and super explicit about times that it's different. This is also true with kids with a non-standard English dialect, is to name it and to not use any shame, not say this is wrong, but to say, well, in American or in English, this is the way that you're going to structure it. Asking questions about their own language and being interested in a respectful way, like, wow, how would you say that in Chinese? Or how would you translate that directly? But wow, that's really cool. It's blah, 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 blah. So a lot of it is that also the techniques of English as a second language.
Marie Carmen is asking another question about how do you test executive functions? Are there proven methods to remediate executive functions? And I'm assuming she's referring to executive functions in relation to writing.
Okay, testing, it's going to be referring them to a neuropsych probably. The Connors is a really good test. It's symptomatic behavioral, but it's pretty good. There are also other tests, the NEPSI, but these are things that a neuropsychologist will probably use. One of the programs that's made for this is what I referred to earlier, Architects for Learning. They're explicitly working or aiming for kids with executive function issues. Another one is, and I hope I get this in the right order, SQL writing, which I believe is Learning by Design. It's a Learning by Design program, but it's aimed at kids with executive function issues in their writing. And the overarching piece is that you want to be really explicit in the structure of writing, the different structures of different types of writing, the language, the needs that are there, and you want to use a very explicit teaching graphic organizer, not, you know, the hamburger, not the ice cream cone where you're like, okay, beginning, middle, and end, what does that mean? Where do you do those things? Because what you're trying to do is give the cognitive organization, give the cognitive structure, and give the sorting, you know, the categorizing of different types of language and structures for the kid, because it's going to be hard for them to do that themselves.
Okay. Two more kind of quick ones, I hope, because we're really going way over time here, but this is wonderful, and it's great that we have all these questions. Maria Cecilia asks, do you explicitly teach sentence writing before paragraph structure?
Yes, especially for the kids with a language disorder. A lot of times that's what they need. I guess I shouldn't say yes. If they need it, yes. Some kids already have it. Kids with dyslexia may or may not. It's really the language disorder kids who are going to need that. And yeah, they need the structure. They need an incremented thing that goes through, you know, clauses and embedded clauses. Local coherence is something they need taught, and that's going to help them with their writing. I'm not sure that I would do that only instead, or wait for paragraphs until that was done. I don't know the research on this, but my gut feeling is that you can really develop both together. I know Christensen, who really talked a lot about sort of that generative grammar, said you should work on the grammar or the sentence structure first, the sentence level first, and then move on. Yeah, I can't think of another example of that. Oh, models, the sort of models of writing, and I'm trying to think of the person who did this, but mentor texts are good for helping kids realize or learn how to do that sentence structure.
Okay, thank you. And the last question is, what is the best font to use for these students?
I don't know that there is a best font, but what you want to do is make sure that it's not serifed. So Arial, Verdana, whatever ones don't have curly cues. I like Verdana because it's not proportional. That is, it doesn't squish together when there's a smaller letter. It sort of gives more space to it, but for sure make sure that it's not serifed, you know, no curly cues, not Times New Roman, and certainly nothing super fancy and scripty and all of that stuff.
Okay. A number of people, though, have written in to thank you, Diana, and I will send you a copy of the whole Q&A so you can read your accolades. One person has asked whether we'll be able to rewatch the webinar, and absolutely, in about a week, it will be on the AET website. If you don't already have a webinar account on the website, it's easy to make one. It's free. And then you have access to all the webinars that we've done that are in the archives. This one will be posted hopefully within a week. That's what we aim for. And the handout will be available there too. So again, we thank everybody who attended. And Diana, we very much thank you. It was just wonderful, and we really appreciate your sharing all your wonderful knowledge and expertise.